Every child in India knows Russia is India's best friend. PM Modi says this to President Putin on the margins of the BRICS summit held in Brazil
July 2014.
But what makes us Indians call Russia a friend in the world of geopolitics where there are no permanent friends, only permanent interests? What have they done as such? Let's explore the reasons and understand as to what makes Russia a reliable, stable and a time-tested partner in this video where we dive deep into the history of the much revered Indo-Russian ties. So the Soviet Union became one of the earliest countries to recognize India's independence from the British. So what is this recognition in geopolitics? A recognition of a state means that the country recognizing the state acknowledges its sovereignty and territorial integrity. Means that there is a territory, a land with a people, and that land is governed by a government, and that government represents the recognized country in the international forum, and that it is independent and takes its own decisions. So literally USSR recognizing Indian independence meant that India was no longer a colony of the British and is an independent country taking its own decisions. Having a definite territory and the government represents India in international relations with whom a country can have diplomatic relations. So USSR recognized the Indian independence in April 1947, and this was the start of the India-Russian relations officially. So at that time, it was not like USSR was just interested to have ties with only India. It was also interested to have closer ties with Pakistan as well. But Pakistan was more interested to be closer with the USA, the Cold War enemy of the USSR. So USSR from then on got much closer to India and became pro-India. By the rule book, enemy's enemy became best friends. Pakistan towards USA and India towards Russia. USSR proved its pro-India stance 3 times in the 1950s when it vetoed in favor of India in the UN. This was a very crucial move that USSR made in favor of India. Let me tell you how. So before that, let's understand what is this veto. So in United Nations, one of the main organ is a wing called UNSC, the United Nations Security Council, which consists of permanent and non-permanent members. Veto can be simply understood as saying no. Veto power is exclusively available to the 5 permanent members of the UN, such as the USA, Russia, China, United Kingdom, and the France. Suppose there is a war and the situation is threatening the world peace. So this particular problem can be tabled at the UN as a resolution to stop the war and restore peace through it. Members of the UN vote in favor, against, or abstain from voting the resolution. Regardless of the votes, if any of the 5 permanent members veto the resolution, it won't be adopted. So after independence, Kashmir joined India through instrument of accession, and Jammu Kashmir became integral part of India. We all know Pakistan wanted Kashmir and tried to internationalize the Kashmir issue with the help of Americans. So USA, back then the ally of Pakistan, tabled a resolution so that UN mediates between India and Pakistan. So the resolution was brought in the UNSC. It was voted by the USA, its allies UK and France. It was almost about to be passed. If it was passed, Kashmir would have become an international issue. Jammu and Kashmir is very much an integral part of India, and it's an internal matter of India. If there was any dispute, it should have been resolved bilaterally. It should be resolved bilaterally. If the resolution would have been passed, the USA through the UN would have interfered in the issue and unfairly would have favored Pakistan, since Pakistan and USA were close allies back then. But the USSR vetoed it. It used its veto power and favored India, thereby cutting down the external interference in the Kashmir issue. USSR had India's back at the UN, which totally foiled Pakistan's attempt. Also in 1961, USSR uses its veto power again to help India, but this time it was a different issue and not the Kashmir issue. Let me tell you how. We all know India got its independence in 1947, but even in 1961, Goa was still at the hands of the Portuguese. An Indian fisherman was fired near Arabian Sea by the Portuguese government. And the Indian government in return had to take action against the Portuguese government. So in return, India tried to take military action against the Portuguese to liberate Goa from the Portuguese hands. But Portuguese quickly ran to the UN and tabled a resolution in the UN asking India to withdraw its troops from Goa. As usual, it got support from the UK, USA, France and Brazil. If the resolution would have been passed, the Indian government would have had to withdraw its forces from Goa, and Goa would have still remained at the hands of Portuguese. But once again, the USSR steps up for India once again at the UN, uses its veto power to block the resolution. So this support of USSR for India was also backed up by Liberia, Sri Lanka and United Arab Republic. It's not to be confused with the United Arab Emirates. It was a political union of Egypt and Syria. So this vetoing of the resolution helped India to liberate Goa from the Portuguese rule through military action, and Goa became an integral part of India. It was inducted into the Union of India as a union territory. We all know that there was a Cold War going on between the USA and the USSR. Both the powers used to try to pull countries to their side by helping them through aid and assistance. In 1950s, India was a very poor nation with no proper machine building industries, and there was very little industrialization. If India had to grow economically and develop as a nation, it needed industrialization and it needed capital for industrialization. India did not have both and was in need of external assistance who wouldn't exploit them and who would be trustworthy. USSR and USA and the other Western countries like Germany came to help India in industrialization. But there was a significant difference in the approach in helping India. Soviet Union's help was to lift India from its backwardness into the modern era to make it self-reliant. But the Western countries tried to make profit from India's situation. They tried to exploit India. So for example, Russia offers to help India in building the Bilai steel plant. Meanwhile, even Germany offered India to build the Rourkela steel plant. Both the countries were ready to give India line credit. But here comes the difference in the help. Germany quoted to give credit at the rate of 6% and repayment in 3 years along with a management fee of 0.25%. But USSR quoted to credit at just 2.5% with a repayment tenure of 12 years and free of cost management. Soviet Union used to transfer technology and the modern manufacturing technique without holding any patent rights. But on the other hand, Western countries transferred obsolete and old technologies and extracted maximum price for the use of it. The West used technology as an instrument of domination. Soviets not only transferred the technologies, they also focused on training the Indian personnels and making them comfortable with the technology and the equipment. On the other hand, Germany just sent 300 of its experts without properly training the Indian personnel and not even transferring the responsibility for efficient functioning. By just transferring technology and not teaching us how to use it, how are we even going to learn to use it? And that to an obsolete and old one. Basically, are you really trying to help us or just for the namesake of it? The US envoy, John Kenneth himself, once quoted that the American help primarily targeted to the Tatas and the Birlas who were already rich, but the Soviets built a plan which belonged to the people of India. So for supplying arms also, Soviet Union did not impose any kind of limitations, like putting a bar on India to not acquire military hardware from other countries. But USA told India that if you want military assistance, then you should be using it against China only because Pakistan was their friend. If a help comes with conditions, is it really a help? It's business, right? We got loans from both the Russians as well as the Americans. But how did we repay them? How was the repayment conditions? So to the US, we could pay only through their currencies, the dollars. And paying through their own currencies would only benefit them more, right? Because you had to pay through the government's fiscal resources. But USSR's loans could be repaid through exports. Something like an export. Exporting commodities like Indian tea, leather, textile goods, which would more sort of benefit our own people, who would now be incentivized to produce more, because now there's a market in Russia. If the USSR gave arms to India, it never put any condition as to how much to use and against whom to use. But the West used to put conditions to not use the weapons against so and so countries and to use the weapons only against so and so countries. And at that time, when India was poor and was trying to create jobs, the majority of the jobs were created by the government PSUs, BHEL, the ONGC, HAL, and many more. These were the primary drivers of the economy and the biggest job creators, which were all built by the Soviet assistance. It's not that the USSR did not have any political or economic gains. It did gain a lot economically, and also politically, it wanted to cut down Western influence and take India to its side. The West provided aid and assistance to India as well, but what makes the USSR's aid different was the aid never came with any conditions attached to it, unlike the Western assistance, which always came with conditions attached to it. And US would suddenly stop its aid if India ever acted against the American wishes. So for example, India was a food deficient country. It depended on food assistance from the US. The US used to provide surplus wheat they produced to India. This was under a program called PL 480. But during the India-Pakistan war in 1965, US, which was in support of Pakistan, threatened to stop the wheat supply if India didn't stop the war. In the 1970s, the Indo-Russian relations start with a bang. In 1971, India and USSR sign a crucial treaty, the Treaty of Friendship, Peace and Cooperation, one of the most important treaties ever signed by India. This went on to help India win a crucial war, break Pakistan into two, stopped a deadly genocide, and gave birth to a new country. But although today that new country wants to become like its old. A lot of people think that this friendship treaty with the USSR was a hasty decision taken. The drafting of the treaty started in 1969, but internal political situations dragged the signing in 1970. So what happened in 1971? Was PM Indira Gandhi forced to sign this treaty because the India-Pakistan war broke? No, it was signed even before the war broke out. Let me tell you how. At that time, there was always geopolitical tension between India and Pakistan. And it always looked like they would go on to a war anytime. And on one fine day in 1970, the US Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, goes on to visit China via Pakistan secretly. So this rang alarm bells in New Delhi. So at that time, the leadership thought, if a war, which was very likely to break out and which eventually broke out soon, the US would team up with China to provide support to Pakistan. So if Pakistan would have had the support of a bigger power like US, India also would definitely need the support of another bigger power. So India signed a crucial treaty with the USSR, the Treaty of Friendship, Peace and Cooperation. According to the Article 3 of this treaty, in case of a situation which constitutes a threat to peace or a breach of peace, they would immediately contact each other for eliminating the threat and re-establishing peace. This treaty was signed in August 1971 and came into work immediately in December. India and Pakistan were at war. India was thrashing the Pakistani defense forces. At that time, US, which was supporting Pakistan and which was against India, decided to intervene. So America sends Task Force 74, its 7th Naval Fleet, towards the Bay of Bengal. And its close western ally, UK, sends HMS Eagle, a very powerful aircraft carrier, towards the Arabian Sea. Together, they planned to encircle India from all sides. And now, what was in the treaty? So if there was an attack by an external country, there would be help from your partner. So India, which had signed a treaty with the USSR, immediately sends an SOS to them. Tensions rising, and USSR immediately responds, sends a flotilla of navy ships from Vladivostok. And with the Russian entry, the two naval fleets of USA and UK that were on their way completely changed their route and took a U-turn. So with threats from the US and UK averted, India effortlessly downed Pakistan in the war and liberated Bangladesh from the cusp of the Pakistani rule. Okay, USSR repealed a possible intervention from US, but what about China? First of all, it was really very difficult for the Chinese troops to enter India from land, as the mountain passes through which they could enter were covered with ice, as it was peak winter. And even if it was to enter, the Russian ambassador to India had assured, if China moved in Ladakh, Russia would respond in Xinjiang, and 1 million Russian troops were already stationed on the Chinese border. And as usual, went to the UN, tried to use its permanent membership to stop India from advancing its forces in the war and get a ceasefire. US brings a resolution for this. And as usual, USSR uses its veto power to block the resolution and allow India to continue with the war and end up victorious. So this is how India defeated Pakistan in the 1971 war. So now let's talk about the Russian help in India's space development. Before understanding the India-Russian space cooperation, let's understand some background as to how India entered into the space program. Globally, space programs began in late 1940s and 1950s, and India's technological landscape was very poor. But one was very clear in his aspiration to develop India through space technologies. He was none other than Dr. Vikram Sarabhai. He convinced the government to have an institutionalized space technology for 10 years, and finally in 1962, INCOSPAR was born, which went on to become ISRO. In 1963, Tumba rocket station was established with the help from various places, including the US, USSR, UK, France, and many more places. And by 1975, India developed its first satellite, named after our great astronomer Aryabhatta. But to launch Aryabhatta to space, India didn't have enough launch facilities. The US offered to facilitate India's launch at an affordable rate, but the Indian ambassador in Russia was approached to help India with its first launch. The USSR offered free launch of India's satellite. Not only it gave free launch, it also supplied the reaction control systems, solar panels, chemical batteries, and tape recorders, and also data storage and many more such equipments that India lacked and India badly needed to begin its space activities. So on 19 April 1975, India launched its first satellite into space with the help of the Soviet launch vehicle Cosmos 3M from Kasputin Yar in Russia. This was followed by two experimental Earth observation satellites, Bhaskara 1 and Bhaskara 2. The Soviets' help in space sector didn't just stop here. They trained Indian astronauts, helped India to develop spacecrafts, space propulsion engineering, construct cryogenic engines, and establish ground stations. India wanted to become self-reliant in space, and Soviets' assistance paved way for it. USSR did this through transferring technology, from which India could build on to become self-reliant and achieve its national goals. So now let's get into the main cornerstone of the India-Russian relationship, the defense. So as soon as India got independence, it was faced with a hostile neighborhood. There was a need to strengthen the defense, but India was poor and technologically backward. It also had to depend on bigger powers. Up until 1959, Indian forces exclusively depended on the Western countries for equipments because we historically had strong links with the Western world. But by 1959, India understood that it was going to face serious security threats from the communist China. And also at that time, there was an ongoing Soviet-China dispute. So at this backdrop, India purchased its first equipments from the Soviet, AN-12 aircraft and 3 Mi-4 helicopters. And then in 1961, US offered Pakistan an F-104 starfighter aircraft. This starfighter aircraft put Pakistan in advantage of India in air defense. Now India needed to have an appropriate aircraft that could counter Pakistan's superior aircraft. Consequently, the US didn't allow this aircraft to be sold to India. India now had to buy one such aircraft equivalent of the Pakistan one, and it had to come at a lower cost, matched with their philosophy of self-reliance. Means the aircraft should be available for licensed manufacturing in the country and come at a long-term credit to cover the manufacturing program. Now, who could offer India an aircraft attending to all such conditions? It was once again the USSR. Accepting all the conditions, the Soviet Union agreed to sell the MiG-21 aircraft to India. Once again transferring technology, helping India to set up factories to produce MiG aircrafts. It also modified the credit terms from 5 years to 10 years to ease the burden of repayment for India. And a point to be noted here, even the Chinese wanted to buy MiG-21 aircrafts, but it was denied by the Soviets. This MiG-21 aircraft was crucial for India in their war with Pakistan in 1965. The US, in this case too, under its military assistance program, was never willing to transfer technology of any of the defense equipments and didn't allow its Western allies to. The US wasn't ready to transfer lethal weapons too, such as the combat aircraft, artillery, nor even a self-loading M14 rifle. When India asked for a supply dropping aircraft, which is an aircraft specially made to drop supplies from the top, the US agreed to offer it, but put a condition that only the US Air Force can drop supplies from the aircraft. On the other hand, USSR transferred lethal weapons such as 130mm medium guns, amphibian tanks, more MiG-21 squadrons, Sukhoi bomber aircrafts, 130mm artillery, missile boats, and submarines, and also transferring technology with that. And also, whenever an upgraded version of an existing equipment was made, it was immediately made available to India. For example, in the mid-70s, an advanced version of MiG-21 was made. It was immediately made available to India. And even MiG-23, MiG-25 was all transferred once it was manufactured. And why such emphasis on technology transfers? Why was India hell-bent on getting transfer of technology? Because only then you could become self-reliant. When you have the technology to make things, you can make it by your own. You don't have to depend on anyone. You don't need to be a buyer forever. That is something the US did not want. It wanted India to be a buyer forever. But the Soviet Union made sure that their partnership with India be mutually beneficial to each other, unlike the US, which wanted maximum benefits out of any deal. So to summarize things, the Russian defense purchases were way cheaper compared to that of the West. They allowed for licensed production, and they were willing to accept a barter arrangement where India could pay back its defense imports through exports of consumer goods. This clearly made the USSR the most reliable and stable defense partner. And so the defense partnership, the peak of this defense cooperation was in 1988, when USSR released a nuclear submarine to India despite chances of facing wrath from the Western world. This also paved way for India to develop its own indigenous submarines. By 1991, about 70% of Indian Army's armaments, 80% of its air force systems, and 85% of its naval platforms were of Soviet origin. The Soviets had always prioritized keeping close relations with India as part of their new Third World policy. An example to this once, the Soviet General Secretary Gorbachev had urged PM Rajiv Gandhi to help them set up an Asian collective security system to contain China. But Rajiv Gandhi didn't show any interest. And in the late 80s, USSR improved relations with China. But still, even though, kept having close relations with India as a high priority in their foreign policy. But post-91, it was a different story altogether. Or at least potentially it should have been. Critics have always argued that the Soviet closeness with India was always due to the Cold War and that it didn't want to see India drifting away towards the West. Once the Cold War ended, the Russians wouldn't hold India in such a big space in their foreign policy. Basically, to engage with India would not be relevant anymore. And incidentally, in 1991, the Cold War ended. The USSR disintegrated. It was now the Russian Federation. Russia was in economic crisis now. On the other hand, even India was in an economic crisis. It started liberalizing, that is, opening up its economy to the world, putting an end to the 40 years of stagnant growth because of the Nehruvian socialism it adopted. Since it opened up its economy to the world, it had to draw foreign investments, and foreign investments primarily came from the Western world. It couldn't turn up to the USSR like before. In fact, Russia itself post-disintegration had to turn up to the West for fixing its economic woes. Such was the condition in both the countries. And as critics had said, the Indo-Russian relations started to weaken in the 90s. There were severe disruptions affecting the supply of the spare parts for many Soviet-made military platforms and ammunitions. It is also at this time, India had a debt of $30 billion against Russia on account of the past defense transactions. But this time, India repaid the debt in dollars rather than their usual barter agreement, so as to help Russia fix its economic woes as soon as possible. India was one of the very few developing countries that repaid its debt in full to the Russian Federation. This resonated well with Russian leadership. This, even today, is remembered by the Russians with gratitude. But even though in this period, between India and Russia, economic activity declined, science and technology collaboration collapsed, and military cooperation took a dead shift drop, it looked as though Indian-Russian relations were headed towards a dead end. The dependence of both nations towards the West seemed like the fall of India-Soviet relations. But in 2000, Vladimir Putin is elected as the Russian president and begins yet another new chapter in the India-Russian relations. President Putin goes on to state that India was a key priority partner, and further goes on to say, irrespective of the trajectory of Russia's relations with other countries, there would never be alternatives to relations with India or any prejudice towards them. So India is back again as a high priority in Russia's foreign policy after a decline of 10 years. It started to normalize again. The ties got to earlier Soviet era levels. There were annual meetings. Means every year top leaders of India and Russia used to meet, and regular high-level meetings and joint consultation used to happen. In 2000, Putin visits India, and both the countries signed the declaration of India-Russian strategic partnership. Now, the relationship took new shape, not just a buyer-seller relationship, but a partnership, like two people working together. Together, they decided on joint production, a more sort of a cooperative relationship with a joint research, design and production, unlike before. The BrahMos missile system is a shining example of this cooperation, where it was joint R&D, production and marketing. And also they had joint development of 5th generation fighter aircraft and multi-transport aircraft. Easily Russia could have said a no to a joint partnership. Because in long term you would be losing a buyer, right? Imagine you're selling biryani to a customer, and suddenly the customer asks you to start making biryanis in partnership with you. Now in partnership, you have to reveal the recipe. You have to teach him how to make a biryani. Would you agree to that? Your customer gets to know how to make biryanis, and with time, he would become self-sufficient in making biryanis by himself. If he becomes self-sufficient, he will make it by himself, and you are bound to lose a customer. You are losing a customer, and especially in geopolitics and in defense, you have very limited customers to whom you can export. If you start partnering them also, they become self-reliant, although you jointly produce. But this mutual trust and understanding between India and Russia paved a way for a greater cooperation, where both the countries not only conducted joint research, but also produced and marketed advanced defense technologies, where they together could find a buyer. And as years passed, more projects were added to the Indo-Russian joint ventures. In 2010, India-Russia decided to further elevate the strategic partnership to the level of a special and privileged strategic partnership. This cooperation was not just confined to defense and space, but also in energy, trade, investments, and a wide range of sectors. Russia helped build the Kudankulam nuclear plant in Tamil Nadu, signed several hydrocarbon agreements, and today is one of the largest supplier of oil to India, and that too offers oil at a discount. In October 2016 in Goa, the two adopted a joint statement, Partnership for Global Peace and Stability, which resulted in 19 cooperation agreements in areas including defense, space, trade and investment, hydrocarbons, and railways. They cooperate in almost every major sector, catching the latest trend in technology. So to put in summary, we can clearly see Russia as a time-tested partner because it has stood the test of time. Leaderships changed, the global landscape changed, financial constraints emerged, but with time, the India-Russian partnership has only gotten better. Russia is a stable and reliable partner because it has never betrayed India in any circumstances. Nor even India has betrayed Russia at any point of time. Russia has defended India each time at the global stage. The example is its usage of veto power in favor of India even now. It has always been consistent in its support to India, be it the 60s or the present time. For example, Russia has always seen Kashmir as an internal matter of India and a bilateral issue with Pakistan, avoiding an internal issue becoming a global issue. And that is why India takes a neutral stand in Russia's war with Ukraine by abstaining to vote against them in the UN Security Council. And also when US and its allies put sanctions on Russia and asked India to be a part of the group, India doesn't join or neither support that group, despite the threat of a secondary sanctions on itself. India also opposed the expulsion of Russia from G20. And now, of course, India has diversified its defense imports, gotten closer with USA, but that hasn't strained its relationship with Russia. Russia clearly understands the importance for India engaging with the West. This side, India too understands the compulsion of Russia getting closer to China. There has always been a good communication between both the countries. India and Russian bilateral relation is one built on foundations of mutual trust, cooperation, respect, and clear communication. Russia continues and is very likely to continue as a trusted, reliable, stable, and a time-tested partner for years to come. So by now, you might have understood why we owe so much to Russia. Why should we be so grateful to Russia? Why should we have so much gratitude to Russia? India-Russian relationship is beyond geopolitics. It's a story of true friendship. So to conclude, I've attached the sources I've referred to in the description. You can go through it to have a deeper understanding of the ties between both the countries. And I hope you enjoyed the video, learned new things, and have newer perspectives. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share this to your friends and family. I hope you all have a great day. Cheers.